Well, as of recording on this, it's Monday, and I am not at work. I'm actually not feeling very well. I'm heading to the doctor actually right now. So, worked a little bit on my laptop and shot some emails around and made sure I was caught up on everything that I needed to be caught up on. And now I'm heading over to the doctor. So would all of that prevent me from weighing in on Batman versus Superman? I trust, dear watcher, that you know me better than that by now. Okay, so I want to address one particular thing about Batman versus Superman in this video. And when I posted on Friday that I was going to go see it, throughout the weekend all my friends were asking me about it. And I said, I was very good, loved it. And they seemed surprised by that. And they said some variation of, well, I saw a pretty scathing review of it. And so my video today is to not really go into the details of the movie, but specifically say, stop saying that. Just stop. And here's why. Because the critics hate all of Zack Snyder's movies. All of them. You know, the first couple, and for the sake of discussion, I am not putting Dawn of the Dead into this category because Dawn of the Dead was a completely different sort of thing from what we all know and love Zack Snyder for. So, taking Dawn of the Dead out, the first two on Rotten Tomatoes do have a little fresh tomato biome, but only barely. 300 was somewhere like around 70%. Watchmen was in the 60s. Legend of the Guardians was hovering around there. Legend of the Guardians. It's an animated movie about owls. You can't go wrong with that. One of my personal favorites, Sucker Punch, down somewhere like in the 20s. Let's just face it. I mean, critics just have had a worsening opinion of Zack Snyder for years. And that's okay. He's not making movies for the critics. The box office returns on all of his movies have been quite good, showing that the fans like him. Now, that does not automatically make him good. The box office returns for Michael Bay films are fantastic, and he's very bad. Not that I don't enjoy a Michael Bay film every once in a while. Some of them I enjoy very much, but they are not good films. They are films where you just go to watch pretty explosions. And a lot of people have said the same thing about Zack Snyder, and they'll lump him in the same kind of category as Michael Bay. I don't think you can do that. And I think the real problem here is that you can't lump Zack Snyder in with actually any filmmaker. The best comparison with what Zack Snyder is doing is comic books. He is making live-action comic books. And he did not invent this genre. People have been doing this before. Ang Lee tried it disastrously so with the Hulk, and it turned out to just be a bad Ang Lee film set in different frames around the screen. That was the wrong approach. Robert Rodriguez did a very excellent approach to it in Sin City, and we can argue that that is stylistically the closest thing that we have to what Zack Snyder's doing, and there's a reason for that, and the reason for that is Frank Miller. Frank Miller is clearly one of the big influences on Zack Snyder, not only because Snyder has now made two Frank Miller stories into movies, 300 and Dark Knight Returns, which is really the primary influence of this film. Not only that, but you can see it. You can see the debt that he owes to Frank Miller in those in all of his movies, even the ones that aren't directly based on a Frank Miller story. when we recognize that as Zack Snyder's primary influence, and if you compare this movie with stuff like Dark Knight Returns, I mean, there are some scenes in the movie that are just cut directly out of that comic book, and images that I'm sitting in the theater going, "That's Frank Miller. That's Frank Miller. Yep, that's Frank Miller." So, when you recognize what he's really doing, you're going to be able to see why he's not really a Michael Bay, and he's not really a J.J. Abrams, and he's not really a Joss Whedon or any of those type of people. He's really a Frank Miller. He's really a Jim Lee. He's in that category. And that's going to explain most of the issues with his filmmaking. Comic books, especially when you're dealing with the major characters, do not have a lot of character development. There's a reason for that. We've had 75 years of Batman. We can't suddenly change his character in the middle of an epic story arc. We can nudge him in a direction or two, but we can't change his character. I mean, goodness, think about when J. Michael Straczynski wrote that, like, Spider-Man's powers were partially supernatural, how big of a freak out everybody had over that. And so, what you try to do is you try to make the plot big and epic and crazy and, you know, have these over-the-top enemies and these great action scenes, and maybe you nudge the characters toward a certain goal, but you're not going to have a lot of character development. That's intentional. And so when you realize that, it starts to make sense why Zack Snyder films don't have a lot of character development. They're much more focused on the plot, on the effects, and not on the characters. Now that by itself sounds like a Michael Bay film. Very quickly, there's one major disadvantage to doing these videos on my phone, and that's when somebody texts me. Somebody just texted me. Right when I was saying that, somebody texted me. Oh, goodness. So all of that being said, I'm not saying that you have to like Zack Snyder. I happen to love Zack Snyder films, but there's a lot of people I respect who don't. What I am saying is, you know, before we go into stuff, we need to recognize what it is. And I love, first of all, I love Rotten Tomatoes, but I am not going to look at that site for a Zack Snyder film because I already know the critics have panned, you know, several of his films that I have just loved. And so I'm going to ignore them on that. And you also need to figure out what type of movies you agree with critics about and what type you don't. And the type that you don't, just go see them anyways and ignore what the critics say. But secondly, do not go into that movie thinking that you're going in to see a Marvel film, that you're going to see a Michael Bay film, that you're going to go in or even see Dark Knight Trilogy. Because Dark Knight Trilogy, like this movie, is very, very dark, but Dark Knight Trilogy is taking the comic book genre and making it something much more realistic and much less comic booky. And Zack Snyder is not going to do that. He's going to make it much more comic booky. Not in the light and fluffy and humorous way of making everything kind of over the top and colorful. He's taking it more in a comic booky way, as in, you know, kind of a Frank Miller or an Alan Moore type of a way that's still plot-wise not at all realistic, dealing with superheroes, but also very dark and sometimes very grim. So if you go in recognizing that, then you're going to have a much better chance enjoying the film for what it is, instead of perhaps taking your young kids in thinking that this is going to be another Avengers movie, and it's not. Or going in thinking, hey, we're going to wait for all the character development of a Christopher Nolan film, because it ain't that either.